welcome back to another great episode of Scandal Queens. It is me here today, as always, EB, taking you back into the murky and scandalous waters of Hollywood. And today we're really getting into it. We're getting into the kind of like dirtiest, murkiest waters of them all, Hollywood and the mafia. Now, if you grew up like me with parents ranting about Kennedy and Sinatra and the mob, then not all of this is going to be a new concept to you, right? Hollywood and the mafia, organized crime, you know, it all just kind of gets together. But the story goes way deeper than just Frank Sinatra singing in some mob clubs and Bugsy Siegel cozying up and being BFFs with Jean Harlow. The roots of Hollywood's work with the mafia and vice versa is one that goes back decades, literally to the beginning of the American motion picture industry itself. From the very earliest days of barely moving pictures, organized crime figures have used the glitz and the glamour of the big screen to manipulate the real world behind the scenes, sometimes in ways that changed the course of American and world history, believe it or not. And I know that doesn't seem possible, right? How can a few mobsters bullying some movie stars and studio executives lead to world-changing scandals? Well, that's because when you follow the trail that leads from Hollywood to the mafia, you find yourself in some really strange and unexpected places, specifically in the lap of the CIA, on the fringes of the Kennedy assassination, and get this, at the front door of Cielo Drive on August 9th, 1969. And that's ultimately what it comes down to. If you're someone who wants to understand how intelligence agencies in Hollywood have worked together, which, if you follow me on Patreon, if you're one of the subscribers, then we've been talking about that a little bit. I've been drip feeding it a little bit. But if you want to know how CIA or FBI or any kind of intelligence works with Hollywood, you have to understand the mafia in Hollywood, because all roads ultimately lead you to the same place. Yes, you heard that correctly. Again, follow the central figures of Hollywood and the mob, and you find yourself in the White House and the Pentagon looking at the 1960s through an entirely different lens. So today, we're going to take a look at some of the biggest and most scandalous Hollywood mafia stories, and we're going to look at how those stories and the people involved in them changed history, because it is that serious and it is that important. Far from being a sparkling heaven, a land of milk and plenty, the golden pathway that leads to the Hollywood sign is paved in crime, ambition, death, and corruption. And a lot of that comes down to Hollywood's long-standing and pervasive relationship with the American mafia. So we're going to get into it today. I'm going to tell you about some of the craziest connections between Hollywood and the mafia, and some of it's going to spiral into some really crazy intelligence stories. So buckle up. It's going to be a ride. But first, though, let's do a very quick, short, brief temperature check and see what the rest of Hollywood is up to. Starting strong, Ariana Grande finally announced that she is stepping away from the public eye. That's right, Ariana Grande has announced that that's it. She's done after this new pedal tour due to what her team is calling insane scrutiny or something like that. She's stepping back. She's going to be out of the public eye. She's going to stop rubbing whatever's going on with her in everyone's face. The whole announcement that just came out about a week ago, about the time of this recording, it just smacks of like a hissy fit, right? After the public's overwhelmingly negative reaction to Grande's new music video Pedal, in which she showcases a gaunt and skeletal frame while being told could lose a few pounds, just massive backlash, right? Absolutely massive backlash. Fans and the general public have been shocked by the music video. They've been kicking off, and then within a few days, she announced, I'm taking a step back and I'm pulling out of this Broadway play. Now, Ariana has tried to save her ass and say, oh, no, this has been planned. I'm not doing this because you guys are horrified by me rubbing my eating disorder in everyone's face and flaunting it and trying to sell it to children. I decided to do this a long time ago, but that's not true, right? That's not true, because she wouldn't have been scheduled to be in a major Broadway play if she already had scheduled time to take off and be out of the public eye. But it's whatever. Really, all I have to say about it is this. There's like two big things. First, that's badly needed, girl. Get the hell out of the public spotlight. You should not be dealing with whatever you're dealing with on a huge public platform, especially not when you're running your mouth in every opportunity that you can to say that you're healthy when you are clearly not healthy, right? So 100% she needs to get out of the public eye. And I'm not saying she needs to go and be locked up in an attic. She just needs to not be on a public platform. She needs to go live as a civilian away from the public, where she is telling children to be like her, right? Secondly, and this is perhaps the most important part, that announcement was narcissistic rage. It was 100% narcissistic rage. It was a hissy fit and a gaslighting exercise. And it was very much, you can tell when these celebrities and these influencers do these kinds of things, when they make these kinds of statements, you can tell how much they hate their fans, how much they resent them, how stupid they think their fans are. Ariana Grande and her team, their announcement, and then the flurry of announcements after, in which they said, stop talking about us. You're not allowed to say anything negative about us. That's bullying. They are absolute fucking children, and they're throwing a fit. They are essentially saying, you stupid idiots, you were supposed to just go along with this and buy it. Why the fuck didn't you just buy it? So it's just narcissistic rage. It's little toddlers having narcissistic rage and making mean-spirited little posts and shit because they're who they think are stupid, idiotic, pig-headed fans who should just pay them money and shut up with be happy with whatever they get. They're mad because people are not putting up with this anymore. It's done. We've had enough. We've already done this. We don't need to do it anymore. So honestly, I've had moments where I felt bad for Ariana, but that's over. That last announcement, her I'm leaving the public eye, and then all the gaslighting and lies that she's told after that, completely toxic person. She's very conscious of what she's doing. She's just like an evil toddler, right? Throwing a fit because she wasn't allowed to continue being a piece of shit and stealing and grifting from a public that she has no respect for, right? So honestly, good riddance, Ariana. Get better, girl, or don't. Just get off of a public platform while you do whatever you decide you're going to do to yourself. All right, next up, we will keep this brief, but I want to talk about this just a little bit. Jennifer Lopez spotted on a rare family outing with her twins in Italy. So Jennifer Lopez had these obviously stage, we're such a happy family pictures put all over everywhere. And they've garnered a wave of you go mama, you good job mama, all this kind of stuff. And I'm just going to, this is everything I'm about to say as well. Just it's opinion. It's just vibes that I've gotten from collective understandings over the year, but I don't get good vibes from Mommy Lopez. I don't, and the pictures didn't give me good vibes, and I have long not had good vibes about her relationship as a mother with the twins. Again, I'll keep this brief and you can agree with it or not. It's just not good. I just don't good. The photos in Italy, it's not even the photos in Italy themselves, right? You can go back to the graduation photos with her son Max earlier this year. Lopez was standing next to Max, who was extremely thin. Now, we have no idea what's going on with Max. I'm not sitting here telling you to go off and speculate about an 18-year-old. There could be health concerns. There could be any number of things going on. But what immediately I thought when I saw him, immediately my brain went, that looks like there's a documentary from the early 2000s that was on this UK channel called Channel 4. And it was about male anorexia. And it was about how male anorexia was the fastest growing form of anorexia. And all these young boys were getting anorexia and starving themselves to death. It was just this whole thing, right? And the kids in this documentary look like Jennifer Lopez's son, right? And also within that, right, anorexia, of course, it's the result of extreme mental and emotional distress and pressure. And more often than not, people with anorexia develop it as a means of control because they feel like something in their life or their life itself is out of control. And all of that is very interesting to me because if Max were dealing with something like that, which I'm not saying he is, but if he were, it would make sense because we've never heard a nice story about Jennifer Lopez. There has literally never been a nice story about her. If you've ever seen a nice story in the paper about Jennifer Lopez, it's because her team is paid for it to be there. If you have ever spoken to anyone who has actually met Jennifer Lopez, especially if you've ever met anybody who had to work in some kind of service industry with Jennifer Lopez, you know that she is an absolute bitch and a half, right? And the big thing that comes up time and time again is control. It's like narcissism, image obsession, control. It's like that whole, when Jennifer comes into the room, don't make eye contact with her kind of thing, right? So if all of those things that we've heard about Jennifer Lopez over 20 plus years, and remember, she was with P. Diddy for a long time when he was doing really heinous stuff, it would make sense to me then that she might have a child that's struggling. If Jennifer Lopez is as awful as I suspect that she is, if the vibes that I get from her are as rancid as I believe they truly are, then it would make sense, right? So who knows what's going on in this family? Suffice it to say, I've got concerns. I get bad vibes. I'm going to keep a, distant eye on it, but I don't know. J-Lo's never been it for me. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see when her son's memoirs finally come out one day. All right, it is that time. You ready to get into this? Hollywood and the Mafia. Truly some of the craziest, most salacious, and mind-boggling stories you have ever heard in your life. When you hear that old adage, the truth is stranger than fiction, it feels like it was written about this. It feels like it was written about Hollywood and the Mafia, okay? Because I'll tell you what, the whole image that you have in your head of like gangsters in pinstripe suits wielding Tommy guns, nah. There's a reason that image has been created and propagated for you. And you know what? It goes all the way back right to the beginning of Hollywood. Hollywood feels like a forever institution, like something that's been there forever. Like as long as America's been around, it feels like Hollywood has just been out there. Like the sign's always been on top of the hill, but it hasn't been, right? In the scope of things, it is very recent. It is very, very, very new. Like I think I've said in previous episodes, if you could like go back and talk to your great grandparent, maybe three greats. For me, I would just have to go back to a great grandparent, but they would have no idea what Hollywood was. Like they would have existed in a world before motion pictures and especially before Hollywood. So it's very young. It's very new. Nonetheless, it is a fascinating and deep and twisted history, right? So the motion picture industry as we know it kicked off in the orange groves of Southern California in the 1910s. It's about 1911 is when we get the first kind of really settling in. It started first as this bohemian sect. So it was like all the artsy fartsy, we're going to do a little opium and do some art kind of thing from the East Coast. So they set out to get away from these crime circuits and the straight and narrow on the East Coast to seek this like wonderful bohemian artists, fortune in life of anything goes in this quote unquote undiscovered land of the orange groves in California where indigenous people already very much live. Many of these bohemians had already been harried by Thomas Edison because as it turns out, if you were making motion pictures on the East Coast when it first started, you were basically in a racket that was being run by Thomas Edison because he had started this lucrative business licensing his film cameras to people who were now using them to start an industry, right? Like pure American playbook, as old as time. Invent the industry, then corner it and price gouge people. So at the turn of the century, Edison's goons, they would turn up. If you lived out on the East Coast, you lived somewhere like New York City or even as far as Chicago, and you tried to make a movie and you didn't like license a camera from him, let's say your buddy had a camera and you borrowed from them and you guys were like working together, Edison would send goons to come and smash the cameras and destroy your production, like straight up. It didn't matter what you were doing, who you were working for. If you didn't pay Edison what he expected to be paid, then that was going to be the end of your film career. The Bohemians left New York and Chicago behind for that reason. They were tired of being bullied, being harassed, being forced into these rackets. So they settled outside of Los Angeles and they set up some rickety sound stages and they started building elaborate sets for explosive, sometimes literally special effects, right? And these films were often grand spectacles, like employing hundreds of actors at a time to fill out these like sprawling city scenes. So in those old silent films, you see hundreds of people. There's scenes with these hundreds of people. There was this really, really early film. I think it was called Babylon, I think is what it was called. It was one of the very original films, but they built just this immense set. Like the set is unimaginable. I'll try to put some pictures on Patreon, but if not, you should go and look it up. They talk about it in the very opening pages of Hollywood Babylon, which is a pretty fun, fascinating little tabloid book. But yeah, it was unimaginable, the scale and the scope of these productions that they kind of built themselves into. And they had all these practical special effects, and it's just great. The films were grand spectacles employing hundreds. You just can't even imagine. And they would just completely fill out like collapsing buildings and these otherworldly fantasies. Like these true creatives, they would see these beautiful visions and they would go, right, we're going to make it happen here in real life. And they would. Here's a short clip from a 1980 documentary called Hollywood that talks about these first silent films and what they were really like.
When we think of silent films, we tend to think of them all like this. Jerky, flickering, a little absurd, moving at the wrong speed with that tinkling piano. The reality was different.
It's hard to describe the impact of a silent movie. You'd think that this is some dead issue that's long gone, but the silent movies were so well created, so magnificently thought out. The situations were done in such a thing, there is tremendous emotional impact in these things still.
It really did seem like a new horizon of sorts, right? These new filmmakers had total control, and their movies were often emotional, over-the-top productions, only capable of being envisioned by true artisans. However, this new oasis of art and peace that the early filmmakers had created for themselves wasn't going to last very long, because as soon as motion pictures exploded around 1915 and truly became like massively, massively huge commercial successes, and names like Theda Bara became household draws that filled seats in their own right, the corruption moved right in. According to Donis Casey, who wrote this amazing little deep dive into early Hollywood and its crime ties, the article's called Glamorous Immorality, A Brief History of Old Hollywood's Organized Criminals. But they... excellent description of how Hollywood became a center of financial and social power faster than anyone really expected. And that's when the opportunity happens for the bad guys, right? Casey wrote, early Hollywood filmmakers were a bohemian lot, artistic, experimental, and open-minded. By the late 1910s, the movies had become big business, and some of the most successful screenwriters, directors, and producers of the time were women. Opportunity abounded for anybody who could deliver the goods. Studios could hardly make movies fast enough to meet the demand of thousands of theaters in big towns and small, all over the country. Money flowed like a tsunami into Hollywood. The small studios raked in the profits and quickly became big studios run by extremely powerful, extremely rich men. Money, more of it than anyone save a handful of Astors and Vanderbilts had ever seen before. Money really was growing on trees, basically, in Hollywood back then, in a figurative way, of course, but not literally, in a figurative way. But that's really when everything went south. Like if these filmmakers had stayed broke, it would have remained a pure little artistic haven. When the money started rolling in, things got bad right away. So I did, as I'm sure you all can tell, a lot of research for this episode. And when I tell you that I went deep on that deep dive, I mean that I went deep on the deep dive. And it turns out that when you're looking to tell the story of how Hollywood got entangled with the mafia, you don't even really start the story in Hollywood at all. Not directly, right? Because Hollywood, even in the early days, wasn't some isolated island. It was a huge machine by the late 1910s with an ever-expanding register of needs. And one of those needs was talent and labor, talent and labor, talent and labor. And that talent didn't necessarily come from the hills and folds of California. Not in those days. After exhausting a limited pool, the studio heads and directors had to cast a wider net, looking east for the pretty starlets and the hunky heartthrobs that could put butts in the seats. Just as it does now, Hollywood focused its gaze back east, where a whole new generation of young women were starting to look at the Golden Hills as the start of a new life and a source of endless opportunity. Betty Benson was one such ingenue, and the Lincoln Tavern in Morton Grove, Illinois, just outside of Chicago, was one such place that Hollywood often found itself foraging for budding talent. Nora Betty Benson became the center of a huge affair that rocked not only Chicago, but the wider society of East Coast and proper America at large. The trouble all started one April evening in 1915 when Betty was heading to Broadway, which is a very popular nightclub in downtown Chicago of the time. And there, Betty was a dance instructor, quote unquote, which meant that she would do shows, right? She was like one of the dance girls. They would dance, they would get people interested in dancing, they would show them how to do the dances, and so everybody could get involved and have dinner and a supper and a dance and a show, right? Like that whole kind of thing. But mostly she was paid to dress up, look nice, show be one of those girls in the club. So Betty was a popular girl, not at the Broadway, just at the Broadway, but around Chicago in general. And as she would later be forced to admit in a legal deposition, she was a woman who enjoyed the company of men, which is fine. I'm totally great. She sounds fun, to be honest. You'll see why. She sounds like she was a good time. And she liked going out and having a good time with them. She admits to this in this deposition that we're going to get into. She likes it. She likes flirting. She likes doing stuff. So that was probably why when that night in front of the Broadway club, when a car full of 5 men pulled over outside and offered her to get in and come have a good time with them. That's probably why Betty was so quick to say yes, right? Because this is what she likes. She liked having a flirt, meeting a new man, getting some dinner, getting some drinks on the house, whatever. So the group of 5 men pulls up in a car and they say, come on, get in. One of the men in the car is a Dr. Price. And Betty says, I know Dr. Price. He's a friend of mine. He comes into the club all the time. So yeah, fine. I'll get in the car with Dr. Price and his 4 friends and we'll go out to Morton Grove. Now, the group headed out to Morton Grove to Lincoln Tavern. Now, the Lincoln Tavern, even back in those days, had a reputation, some good, some bad. This was just a few years before Prohibition. Well, actually, it's about more than a decade before Prohibition. But there had been an explosion in cars at this time, right? Because Henry Ford invented the mass production assembly line, and as a result, more Americans could afford cars than ever before. Like your great-great-grandmother had a car because of the mass assembly line. It made it cheap. But that meant that you didn't have to stick around town where you lived if you wanted to go out and have a good time, right? You didn't have to stay around the neighbors that you saw every day who talked to your wife and kids. If you wanted to go and get yourself into some situations, couples could load up in their shiny new Fords and hit the road to see what trouble they could get into in the countryside. And that's where roadhouses like the Lincoln Tavern became popular watering holes for the mobile crowd. Roadhouses were essentially entertainment halls, which could be as simple as like a greasy dive bar hole in the wall that just slung some lukewarm beer, or as complex as a full-on like music, dining, dance, and a show theater hall. The idea was simple. You would leave the city, drive out in your car, be able to go into these places, park, go inside, and enjoy your vices in a nice, quiet environment. Why drive all the way to drink cocktails and have dinner and a show? Because the roadhouses around Chicago were built in smaller communities where the police were easier to pay off. That's basically the long and short of it. If you were a rich person who didn't want to be seen, who wanted to do something you weren't supposed to be doing, you could go and do it at a roadhouse because there were either not police in these small towns that they were in, or the police were very, very easy to pay off. So it's a great place to go and get in trouble. These remote locations with flexible or non-existent police made these rowhouses a prime business operation for organized crime groups that were already consolidating in Chicago at the time. There, in these tax-free, cop-free havens, big crime bosses could rub elbows with senators, governors, and the biggest legitimate business heads in the city and state. This is not just where like Joe Schmo went to get drunk. Rich people socialized in these places very, very commonly. It became the kind of place essentially that like the businessmen would quote unquote do business over dinner and drinks. The Lincoln Tavern was one of these roadhouses, one of the two biggest, as they called them, resorts at the time. It was one of the two biggest ones in the area. Located north of Chicago in the remote Morton Grove area, the Lincoln Tavern was a flashy affair. Owned by a prosperous financial broker named Jack Huff, which is very suspicious, who took over the establishment from his wife, May Peach. It was a 2-floor spread that featured full-on floor shows and some of the biggest names in entertainment. Now, by this point, some of you might be thinking, the Lincoln Tavern, that actually sounds quite familiar. The Lincoln Tavern in Chicago, why does that sound so familiar? It probably sounds familiar to you because that's the place where Duke Ellington, the Duke, composed the song Don't Get Around Much Anymore. Not even kidding. That's the Lincoln Tavern is where Don't Get Around Much Anymore happens. So the Lincoln Tavern was a big deal, and it had something else going for it besides the remote location and the lax cops. Besides being conveniently outside of the city, the Lincoln Tavern was a cozy drive for the affluent residents of Chicago who had their big soaring homes on the Gold Coast. So not only is it just outside of Chicago so you can get away from quote unquote society eyes, it's also close enough to the homes of the rich people that it becomes even more attractive for them, a place for them to go and socialize away from trouble. By the time Prohibition kicked into effect in 1920, the Lincoln Tavern was the big boss on Dempsey Street, with one writer asserting in the local paper, "Here, one sees the leaders in business and in the world of accomplishment." So that's probably why Betty Benson was so quick to agree, again, to a ride out to the Lincoln Tavern that night with Dr. Price and his buddies in 1915. Bubbling at the idea of a night filled with champagne and dancing, none of which she had to pay for, Betty climbed into the car with her friend, Dr. Arthur E. Price, who was a married and prominent society man in Chicago, who would later be annihilated by drug addiction and endless scandals. But she got in with him and his 4 friends. They got in the car, and the friends in the car, as would later be exposed when the scandal broke, were Henry Bosch, a wealthy Chicago wallpaper dealer who was the head of the Henry Bosch Company, which was this huge wallpaper company worth millions and millions of dollars. And there was also George Crapville, which what a name, right? Who was an official at the Maryland Casualty Company. Remember that, it's going to be important. And then Mr. Holbert, who was another official of the Maryland Casualty Company. And last but not least, Mr. R. Monroe Ross, who was the general superintendent of the Maryland Casualty Company at the time. And according to Betty's later deposition, the group of 6 enjoyed a rollicking car ride out to the Lincoln Tavern from Chicago. With no room in the car for her among the 5 men, Betty crawled into the lap of Mr. Ross, the general superintendent we just spoke of, who was Yes, very married, very, very married. And they did a lot of cozying. But here's what's quite interesting about Mr. Ross, right? So he was a superintendent for the Maryland Casualty Company, and it turns out I dug around, and that company is a rough arm for the big government subsidized company W.R. Grace & Co. Now, if you were to go to the CIA declassified files and look up W.R. Grace & Co., you would find out that the U.S. government has been courting this company for decades. You would find letters from the director of the CIA in those declassified files begging the head of W.R. Grace & Co. to help him design America's foreign policy in South America. Pretty scary stuff, right? So this Maryland Casualty Company and this Mr. Ross, they work for W.R. Grace & Co. They're essentially the Pinkertons. They kind of mess with the unions. They try to short the union workers to make sure the union workers don't get paid for like horrific injuries that happen in the W.R. Grace & Co. mines. So these are some very powerful, very sinister people that we're talking about with very sinister ties right off the bat in 1915. So they're heading out to the club. Betty is in this Mr. Ross's lap, and he's fondling her. He's got his hand under her dress, and they're just going at it right there in front of everybody. And she seems to be having quite a good time with that. And that seems all good and well. But then the trouble starts when they get to the club, right? Because as the story goes, Betty and the men, they get in there. They have a round of dinner and drinks, and they're dancing. And the Lincoln Tavern at this time was crazy. They had full floor shows. I mean, this is the kind of place that Duke Ellington is going to perform one day. This is like a nice place. But after waves of champagne, Betty said that things turned. She was out in the lobby talking to her friend Mr. Price and his friend Mr. Crapville when Mr. Ross, the man whose lap she had been sitting in and making out with, he comes over to her. And when he walks up to the group, Dr. Price and Mr. Crapville walk away. And Mr. Ross, now alone with Betty, says, "Well, Betty, don't you like him?" And Betty says, "Well, yeah, of course I like him. He's Dr. Price. I know him. He's great." And then Ross says, "That's great. You should fuck him. You should sleep with him." And that's like immediately there's a turn. He says it in different words. They say make a fuss is what the terminology was back then, but that means you need to go and have sex with him. And Betty said, "Oh, I was taken aback. I couldn't believe he was suggesting that I should have sex with this married man." So she gets aback, and before she even has a chance to reply, Mr. Bosch comes out. So now we've got Mr. Bosch and Mr. Ross talking to her. And Mr. Bosch goes into the same thing. He's like, "Oh, Betty, don't you like Dr. Price? You should leave Ross alone, and you should go and sleep with Dr. Price tonight. You should do that. You should do that right now." Betty now is very upset. She's like, "Why are both of you trying to get me to sleep with Dr. Price?" And that's when Bosch blows the lid off the whole thing. He says, "All right, look, Betty, here's the deal. Me and Dr. Price, we're in the same club together, all right?" And he tells Betty, "Because we're in the same club together, I need to get something on him, okay? I need something on him, so I need you to sleep with him so I have something on him because he's married. So if you sleep with him, that gives me some dirt." Bombshell, right? Here's Betty Benson, who's like barely 20 years old, standing in the middle of these like very well-connected, very wealthy, respected, known businessmen in this like somewhat criminal bar. And she's being solicited by this group of powerful and wealthy businessmen to sleep with someone for blackmail. What does that sound like to you? Does that sound roughly familiar to you? Like, I don't know, like Operation Midnight Climax or Jeffrey Epstein? Betty innocently played as though she didn't know what was going on. But later, Mr. Bosch shows up again, and he's drunker this time, okay? And he pulls Betty into one of the Lincoln Tavern's private rooms because here's the thing. Because the Lincoln Tavern is a place where all these rich people are, there's these little private rooms that you can go into to dine, to gamble, to drink, to whatever. So Bosch pulls her into this room. And he's very, very drunk, and he gets very, very emotional. And he starts begging her to sleep with Dr. Price. And she's also getting upset. She's like, "Why are you asking me to have sex with this person that I'm friends with? This is crazy." And so Bosch tells her, "Look, Dr. Price caught me sleeping with his wife a few weeks ago. And now I need blackmail so I can ruin him before he ruins me." Wow. Betty Benson began to cry and told the men that she didn't want to engage in any of their blackmailing games, allegedly. She said that she went out after that conversation. She told Dr. Price, "You need to be careful because these men are trying to get something on you." And as far as Betty was concerned, that was the end of the story. But it turns out it was not the end of the story. Because what really happened is that Betty went home in the car with all the gentlemen, riding again in Mr. Ross's lap. And then when Mr. Ross went to his hotel room, she went up there with him. And after she had given Dr. Price that warning, Dr. Price decided, all right, that's it. I'm going to the press with all of this. The story set off shockwaves when it was released to the press shortly after, and it ended up becoming the center of an acrimonious divorce proceeding between Dr. Price, his wife, and the men he alleged had helped the whole thing along. Because as it turns out, the whole night was a bit of a setup. Dr. Price claimed that the men, who pretty much all worked for the Maryland Casualty Company, had essentially sought the blackmail not to protect themselves, but to help his wife divorce him and get all his money out of him. I am assuming she was a very wealthy, well-to-do woman, and there are insinuations that the Maryland Casualty Company, who I just explained to you, was known for doing grody business, is probably the best way to say it, for companies like W.R. Grace & Co. So that's the insinuation. Essentially that his wife and these men were maybe working like the Pinkerton agency to get blackmail on him so she could get the divorce and take half his shit. They were working as strong arms, right? Like against unions for wealthy, very well-connected masters. So maybe that's what it was, because that is what the claim Dr. Price made was. These high-ranking individuals from the Maryland Casualty Company had been hired to make things go badly for him that night and to get him staged with Betty Benson. The men, who talked about being in a quote-unquote special group together, hinted at prominent and powerful social cliques as well. Their desire to use a woman as a honeypot and subsequent blackmail would smack of later projects like Operation Midnight Climax, run by the CIA, and even Jeffrey Epstein's sexual blackmail ring of the 2000s and 2020s. Betty Benson ended up being forced to give a formal deposition about that night and her role in the events, which ended up being splashed across every paper in Illinois. Her name became notorious, and this was all just weeks before she was due to leave for Hollywood to start her big adventure as an actress. Oh yeah, did I not mention that? Betty Benson was already signed to head out to Hollywood to work with some of the studios on some new movies. So she decided, this cannot stop me. This cannot hold me down. So she goes to the court in the middle of this scandal, and she goes to the lawyers and she says, look, I'll give you a deposition. I'll tell you everything that happened that night, but you got to let me leave to go to Hollywood. I can't stay here and be drawn into a bunch of court stuff. You have to let me go to Hollywood. And they agree, right? They say, yeah, absolutely. So Betty agrees to sit down and gives a formal statement in the offices of Charles E. Selleck in return for being excused from any further trial proceedings. Betty gave her deposition, then set out a few weeks later to start her film career, but it was not a story that would have a happy ending, really, for anybody. Just a year after the Betty Benson affair in Chicago, Betty's name was in the papers again, this time in Hollywood, but not for movies. This time, she had been arrested after her husband, Joe Peppa, a drug smuggler with connections to organized crime, got into a shootout with cops in Mexico. Peppa was arrested. He did survive. He got shot, but he survived, and he was arrested. And after he was arrested, police went to go and search the hotel room that he was sharing with Betty in California. She was immediately arrested because when they did that search, police found opium. They found, I think they called it 2 cards. I don't know what that even means. I couldn't find a picture of this because it's just 1917. But they said they found 2 cards of opium and a big pipe. So Betty served 100 days in jail and was released in 1917. But again, no happy ending. Because get this is, you're probably sitting there going, why are you telling this as a mafia story? This is why. Betty Benson died shortly after her release under mysterious circumstances. The LAPD, who collected the body and ordered the autopsy, claimed that Betty Benson died of pneumonia she contracted in prison. They packed her body up in a casket and they sent it to her home state of Vermont with a letter taped to it that read, "Pneumonia, do not open." Betty Benson's mother, however, became suspicious after receiving her daughter's body and seeing the note on the casket. According to newspaper reports given by officials at the time, Benson's mother had the body turned over by a coroner, and they discovered that her daughter had been shot once in the head, once in the leg, and once in the back, and that one of her legs was also broken. This became another new scandal, and Betty's name was once again splashed all over the papers, but the LAPD would deny the claims and refuse to open any investigation into the once hopeful movie star's death. Her leg had been broken after the casket was dropped, they claimed, and as to the bullet wounds, that's just some holes that get made naturally when bodies are apparently bullet wounds are according to the LAPD, just natural holes that are made while the body's being preserved. So there was never any answer to that. And that was the end of Betty Benson, her scandals, and her mysterious death. But when you look at that, you look at a death covered up by the LAPD, drug dealing with organized crime. Then she's with these big businessmen, big money guys in Chicago who she gets embroiled in a big blackmail scandal with. I don't know. Was Betty Benson a failed actress, or was she perhaps one of Hollywood's first public victims of organized crime like the mafia? Despite deaths like those of Betty Benson, Hollywood soldiered on and continued to make more money than ever before as the 1910s became the Roaring '20s. The motion picture industry was unstoppable, making more and more year after year and doubling their productions to keep it going. All that money made a new generation of powerful elites. Suddenly, it wasn't just the studio heads that had more money than they knew what to do with. Writers, directors, producers, and even some of the talent were making thousands of dollars a week. A week. Imagine making thousands of dollars a week in the 20s. And you know what? It didn't show any sign of slowing either. All that work and all that money meant that you had a herd of people who needed some place to burn off their cash and their stress. An opportunity was born, and organized crime answered the call. At the end of the 20s, the Prohibition Bill rolled into effect. That's not the official name. It was just called Prohibition, and it was outlawing of all beer, wine, and spirits. I tell my UK friends about this sometimes, and some of them think I'm completely making this up. But yes, this is a real historical period of Hollywood, of America, sorry. But it was prohibition. No alcohol, no nothing. You can't have it. It's illegal to make, it's illegal to sell, yada, yada, yada. And this ended up being the dinner bell that got the organized crime serving its meals, as it were, in Hollywood. And they opened a whole new illicit side of Hollywood. I would say the illicit side of Hollywood was then born at this time. There was more need than ever, not just for alcohol, but for drugs, gambling, and prostitution too, after Prohibition came into effect. This first call was answered by two groups, the Committee and the Syndicate, a tight-knit group of local businessmen and corrupt elected officials who provided their services in the shadows and reaped their wealthy rewards in the daylight. The committee were powerful local men, and they saw to the needs of Hollywood by providing the illegal booze and the women or the men and the drugs and anything a star might need to keep their energy up for the 57 movies they were filming at a time. They were kingpins, and by the end of the 1920s, they ran everything without question from the shadows. But that was going to change when the Chicago outfit, at this time led by the infamous mobster Al Capone, decided to set his sights west. Al Capone, while associated strictly with like the brutal bootlegging world of gangland Chicago in the 1920s, was actually a huge movie fan that took an early interest in the Hollywood machine. He didn't stretch his fist out that far at first, though, right? He didn't just go out there and say, "This is mine." As with everything he did, Capone started locally and built his way out there. He started with a young, hungry tough named Johnny Roselli. Roselli, an immigrant with a struggling family story, met Capone in the 20s when he was looking for a better way to move up. He had spent years trying to work straight jobs, but he had eventually been pushed out west where he had fallen in with some low-time gangsters. Looking to really max it out, Roselli headed back out east to Chicago for a big boxing match. There, he met none other than Al Capone. Capone saw something determined in Roselli, who was a really good-looking kid, and Capone decided, you know what? I'm going to get you involved in my newest endeavor, a theater racket. Capone, using his brutes and his goons, had essentially taken over the local theater union in Chicago. But he installed one of his lackeys, first of all, which is quite interesting. This is a guy named George Brown. And George Brown in Chicago gets made the head of this local chapter of the International Alliance of Theater Stage Employees, IATSE. Okay. So Capone, when he decides, I'm going to take over all the theaters in Chicago, he installs George Brown to do it because this union is the one that's running all the theaters and any movie stuff that's going on there. They do everything, right? And so he knows, I got to get this guy. And he's correct, because once Capone has control of that union, the IATSE, and it's like called the local stagehands is the local chapter, that's it. You can't run a theater production in the city unless you pay off Al Capone, because he will just call up his buddy that runs the union and they'll get your actors pulled, they'll get your lighting pulled, they'll get your music pulled, everything, right? So Capone basically takes it by the throat in Chicago, this theater crew. Now, Roselli was the muscle behind this early operation, and he did so well at it that by the end of the 20s, Capone decided, you know what, you got to get out there. You got to go out to Hollywood, and we got to do this there. We've taken over all the theaters here. Let's get out there on the West Coast, and let's do it there. Let's take over the industry there, because there, Capone believed, using Roselli, they would be able to take over the labor unions faster and open up a whole new coastline for big business. So by the end of the 20s, Johnny Roselli was heading west. Again, following a similar pattern that we'll get into more a bit later, but it looks like they sent him out west on this kind of front. And the front was this quote unquote big band guy. Now, it seems to me that when the mafia wanted to work in Hollywood and they wanted to stretch their legs, when they wanted to expand, the best way to do that was to get an in with someone who was very big, who was like very popular, or who had a shtick, You had to send someone out there with a shtick. So they looked like they were just one of the normies. And it looks like with Johnny Roselli, it was Johnny Roselli's orchestra, because I found a couple of these, like 2 or 3 different events. One's in Utah, and it's right around the time that Johnny Roselli gets sent by Capone back out to California. And there's this Johnny Roselli's orchestra, and they go from Chicago to Utah to California. And the next thing you know, handsome Johnny's all over the place with his brooding good looks and immediately sliding into the door in Hollywood as an actor. It wasn't long until Johnny Roselli has made his own name in the pictures, rubbing elbows with some of the biggest names in talent at the time. He didn't find it an easy business muscling into the organized crime world that was already established in Hollywood, though. Despite Capone's massive control in Chicago and the Midwest of theaters, the organized crime world of Hollywood already had an iron curtain built around it. The committee and the syndicate were running a dark underworld, and they didn't feel the need to cut anyone else in on it. The Hollywood that Roselli arrived in, while wealthy beyond anything that you and I are capable of imagining, was a dark place. Okay. There were women like Madame Lee Francis, who ran notorious brothels up and down the Sunset Strip, which were basically haunted for exclusive clients like Spencer Tracy and Tallulah Bankhead. There, they offered men and women their wildest fantasies. Basically, anything went in these places, and the women, who were often encouraged to become hooked on mind-numbing substances and alcohol, were used as props. They couldn't say no. Studios put entire brothels on retainer for exclusive use, ensuring that their star actors during this time could go blow off paid steam whenever and however they wanted. Again, there was no request that could be said no to, and the requests became more and more ludicrous. By the end of the 30s, get this, I didn't even know about that. I'm gonna have to make a video about this. It's fucking crazy. By the end of the 30s, this was such a common practice that it became open secrets in Los Angeles circles that Louis B. Mayer, you know, the one who tried to molest Shirley Temple when she was like 12 years old, Louis B. Mayer owned, and he didn't operate it because, you know, he just put the money in and other people operated for him, but he owned a high-end brothel in Hollywood that catered exclusively to the rich and powerful. And guess what they provided? They provided women who looked exactly like the biggest movie stars of the time. So Barbara Stanwyck, Carol Lombard, whoever was the biggest like female celebrity at the time, they would put women in these brothels that looked exactly like these women. And if they just looked a little bit like them, they would then make them get a bunch of plastic surgery so that they would look just like these actresses. And then they allowed these rich men to come and use and abuse those bodies however they wanted. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that great? Hollywood, it was that's the Hollywood we're talking about that Roselli came to, right? Just a toxic hellscape of a place, especially if you were a woman with no money in her pocketbook. Actors were plied with drugs to keep them working insane hours, and when they went home, they were put to sleep with equally insane tranquilizers, most of them chronically addictive. The drugs trade in Hollywood was seamless, with studios having direct access to peddlers and smugglers who were kept on retainer and on staff so that they could provide to actors while on set, partying, or anywhere else that the studio might send them. It was in this cesspool that Johnny Roselli, known associate and strong arm of Al Capone, decided it was time to push in. Once he had built up a big enough name for himself, he joined forces with a freelance criminal named Tony the Hat Cornero. Cornero was a bootlegger who, after getting out of his most recent prison stint, had set up a series of gambling boats just off the coast of California. It was a brilliant idea. He set up the party yachts 3 miles offshore in international waters where California couldn't do anything about him slinging booze or gambling, and then he used his former smuggling boats to ferry rich people and famous people out to those boats so they could just have these crazy, insane, drunken nights of, again, doing anything and everything they wanted. The two men made a big business together, and with some name and West Coast connections under his belt, Johnny Roselli was finally able to get his muscle moving for Capone. Once Roselli was established, Capone sent George Brown to Hollywood. You remember that guy who was the head of the theater and acting and stagehands and all that union in Chicago? Yeah, well, he decided Roselli's got a niche out there for us. Now we're going to send Brown in to finish the blow. Brown was now the head of the big motion picture union, that IATSE. He was the president of all of it now, right? He was president of all of it by the time Capone sent him out west. So he immediately starts consolidating power for Capone by rounding up the unions and showing who was in charge. The muscle behind Brown, besides Roselli, was a man named William Byoff. The trio, helped along by a soon-to-be Capone successor, Frank Nutty, and the Los Angeles godfather, Jack Drogna, the Chicago outfit took over the Hollywood unions. They took over every union. And there wasn't a studio in town who could get a film made without now paying the Chicago outfit to do it. That was the racket. Pay your money. Everything goes smooth. Refuse to pay up. Refuse to pay Capone. Well, then maybe none of your actors, extras, or camera crew are going to show up. Maybe you show up with some broken legs, right? Because George Brown, their union boss, he was in charge, and anything he didn't like, William Byoff would take care of it violently if he needed to. Do you see how that works? You see how that happened very, very kind of quickly and smoothly in the scheme of things? The Chicago outfit took over Hollywood overnight. Suddenly, names like handsome Johnny Roselli's were big. Backed by Jack Drogna and his Black Hand family, they got in with Art Shaw, the newly elected mayor of LA, who would go down as the most corrupt mayor in LA history, which is like an unbelievable achievement, right? That's like really saying something. Roselli and the rest of the Chicago outfit became untouchable. Roselli became close friends with film producer Brian Foy, who put him in some movies and eventually got him connected with Harry Cohn at Columbia Pictures. He was also frequently seen dining with Edgar Rice Burroughs, the creator of Tarzan. But it wasn't just the fellas who liked Roselli. He did, after all, get the nickname Handsome Johnny for a reason. Over his time in Hollywood, mobster Johnny Roselli grew close to some of the biggest and brightest stars, even romantically. Very early on, probably thanks to her ties to Bugsy Siegel, who worked with Roselli, Jean Harlow dated him, and she was rumored in all the Hollywood gossip rags to be his favorite dancing partner. Later, he would also be romantically linked to Marilyn Monroe, but before then, he shocked Hollywood to the ground when he got engaged to upcoming star June Lang. Now, June Lang was a name that had a lot of momentum around it at the time. She was gearing up not only to be the next big beauty in Hollywood, but the next kind of like sweetheart comedy girl. Like, she was kind of smart and sassy and sharp, but she was like dead gorgeous, right? And she was going that direction. When you see pictures of June, it's pretty obvious to see what Roselli loved about her. Okay, she's very, very pretty. Tall and slim. She was famed for her beauty and graceful carriage. The two eloped in Yuma in the middle of the night. They drove out in the middle of the night, woke up a priest, and got married. And after they were married, June announced that Johnny didn't want her to work, so she was going to quit. Because of course, right? Of course, handsome Johnny doesn't want his beautiful wife, having a career. Why would he? He's a piece of shit. Right? He's a piece of shit. Here's a very rare clip from a once thought lost film that starred June Lang called Isle of Destiny that came out in 1940, the same year she ran off and eloped with Johnny Roselli.
On guard with this gal. Remember, you're meeting society.
Don't worry, I'm going to do my duty, soldier, nothing more.
Well, look at the cute little leatherneck. Max, hand me my bag, please.
Wisecracker.
Did you get a load of that kisser? She chews tobacco.
Yeah. Welcome to Palo Pango, Miss Sullivan.
Now, isn't that sweet? Welcome to Palo Pango. Is that all you have to offer?
Well, we're to convey the commandant's compliments and take you ashore, that's all.
How perfectly military. What do I do, salute?
Well, you might wipe your kisser. The CO is pretty particular about appearances.
As sensational as the marriage was between Roselli and Lang, it was not to last. Just 2 years later, June would file for divorce from Roselli, citing mental cruelty. Johnny moved on quickly, already listing another woman as his emergency contact when he enlisted for World War II shortly before their divorce. Just a couple years after they separated, he was already remarried. Johnny Roselli probably felt untouchable as the 40s gave way to the war that enveloped the nation. He was one of the biggest names in Hollywood circles at that time. There were no doors that weren't open to him, and he and the other players in the Chicago outfit business endeavors were living high on the hog, right? There was no one was going to cross them. Everybody was scared of them until the government decided that it was time for them to take over Hollywood in the 1940s. Johnny Roselli and a host of other mafia grunts and heads got brought down in the 1940s thanks to the government's crackdown on organized crime. Roselli and a host of other bigwigs went to prison for racketeering and half a dozen other crimes. Some of them killed themselves to avoid going to prison. And these crimes totally across the gamut, right? Your typical organized crime, trafficking, smuggling, extortion, you name it. Johnny Roselli did a few years in prison, but was released just a couple of years after World War II ended. He was released to a different country, a country changed by conflict and under control of a new deep state intelligence body. But as much as the world had changed, Johnny Roselli, it seems, had not. He went back into the racket, doing work for Dragna, but it was even harder to run the unions in Hollywood now that the CIA and other government agencies had their fingers all over the pie. Johnny did a couple of movies on what was called Poverty Row back then, but deciding that he just couldn't cut it. He was like, I'm not doing this. I'm working for pennies. This is insulting. So Johnny Roselli's final fall from Golden Hollywood happened, but here's the thing. Happened at just the right time, because in the mid-50s, Roselli ends up getting picked up by Meyer Lansky, the accountant of the mafia. And Meyer goes, hey, Roselli, I really admire the work you used to do with Capone. Why don't you go down to Cuba and manage some of our mafia casinos for us? At which Johnny Roselli goes, absolutely. So he starts managing the Sans Souci Hotel and casino in Havana. Roselli was a riotous success, reliable on every count, and he ended up being like the best man for making sure all the bosses got their cut off the top, right? Which is probably why Meyer Lansky decided in 1960 to set him up in Vegas, where the mafia's gambling operations were expanding. After being ousted from Cuba in the 1959 revolution, mobsters like Meyer Lansky were focusing all their energy on Las Vegas. That's where the money was. So the Cuban casinos had been a kingdom unto themselves, yes, and the mafia had loved them, yes. But after Castro took over, he said, get out. No more you mafia thugs running this. Get your nasty casinos and get out. So the mob's like, right, we gotta focus on Vegas. That's what we gotta do. That has to be the place. And that's where Roselli was sent. You might be tempted to think that the story stops there, right? Oh, that's cute. Roselli worked for Capone, went to jail, got out, works for the mob, does Las Vegas. Great story. Well, it's not the end of it. Vegas was the new playground of the mafia, and Roselli fell right into the lap. He was one of the big heads overseeing all the gambling operations and ensuring that the people who needed to get their cut got their cut, and ideally a larger and larger portion of it every single year. Roselli became one of the most powerful men in Las Vegas, even more powerful than he had been in Hollywood. Suddenly, the biggest stars were crawling to him, begging for a chance to be let in somewhere they could get paid. One of Roselli's biggest and most notorious Hollywood associations that carried right on into Vegas was none other than Frank Sinatra. Sinatra had gotten his start in the 30s, singing in mafia-owned clubs around Los Angeles. By the time the 1950s came around, though, he was heading for a slump. As the story goes, it was Johnny Roselli who got the pull to put Sinatra back on track. The legend was that sometime around 1953, Sinatra basically called him and said, hey man, can you do something for me? I got absolutely no work. I know you're running that thing down in Cuba. Is there anything you can do for me here? And that's exactly what Roselli did. He went and he got in touch with the studio that was doing From Here to Eternity, and he pulled some strings and he got Sinatra on From Here to Eternity with Burt Lancaster, Donna Reed, Montgomery Clift, just a whole bunch. Deborah Kerr, I think, is also in that. It was big. It's the movie that kind of turned Sinatra's career back around and put him back on the map and in the debt of Roselli and the mafia. Their relationship would last several more seemingly successful decades, right into the JFK scandal and the ensuing revelations about Cuba's involvement with the CIA, as it would later be discovered during 1975 investigations into the assassination of John F. Kennedy Jr. in 1963. Johnny Roselli, along with a number of prominent other mafia individuals, had been recruited by the CIA to assassinate Fidel Castro. This is fact. This is all fact. Roselli would testify about his involvement in the plot brought to him by CIA dirty worker Bob Mayhew in 1975, and he would be recalled to testify in 1976 after statements he gave to the Wall Street Journal, in which he indicated that the CIA had also assassinated President Kennedy and arranged for the assassinations/deaths of Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby. All of this, of course, also included a heavy intrigue between Frank Sinatra, John F. Kennedy, and a known mafia girlfriend, Judith Exner Campbell, who had long been romantically tied to Sam Giancana, an associate of Roselli and the CIA, like a major gangster. You can go and look him up as well. He ended up being assassinated in his home. It became clear to the Senate, sorry about that, investigative committee that Roselli knew a lot about what happened during the Kennedy assassination, but Roselli never got to share the full extent of that knowledge. In 1976, his body was discovered by two fishermen curled up and decomposing in a metal barrel that had been wrapped in chains. Pathologists would later find that Roselli had been given a single last drink, his favorite whiskey, then strangled and shot one time in the stomach, probably in the hopes that they would keep him from floating back to the surface. The barrel holding Roselli's body was discovered in Dumbfoundling Bay in Miami, a couple of weeks after the investigative committee resummoned him to testify about the assassination of President Kennedy. And that was the end of Johnny Roselli. Roselli wasn't the first and only mafia mover and shaker in Hollywood, nor would he be the last, because following hot in his heels as the Chicago outfit expanded into Hollywood was the infamous Charlie Barron, a man who would one day be tied, allegedly, quote unquote, to the Manson murders. Charlie Barron never quite rose up to the heights of Roselli, but their stories share similar highs and lows. Barron seems to have gotten his start in Prohibition Chicago, much like Roselli, making similar rounds at the Lincoln Tavern that Betty Benson had all those decades earlier. He was part of a popular dancing act with Joan Blair, and the two became immensely popular in high society circles. By 1932, they were being featured in the Drake Hotel's Gold Coast Room, where big names like Bing Crosby, Walt Disney, George Gershwin, and Charles Lindbergh regularly socialized among some of the most powerful men in American society and industry. Being adored by that kind of crowd can get you some powerful attention too, and that seems to be how it worked for Charlie Barron. He and Joan featured at the Coconut Club in 1934, which was the top of the top for the glitzy society dancing couple like them. By 1940, Barron was running his own club, the Roomba Room, on Thursdays out of the Beverly Hills Athletic Club. It was the perfect front for a man who had already done his dirty work getting made out in Chicago. Charlie's club nights attracted a veritable who's who of Hollywood elites. His first Roomba Room, given in 1940, was attended by Mickey Rooney, Desi Arnaz, Rudy Vallee, Gene Tierney, and a dozen other major names that were already starting to go down in Hollywood legend. It was the perfect place, like associate Johnny Roselli could come and let off steam with their glamorous dates while schmoozing with the rich and the famous in Los Angeles. By the 1940s, Charlie's focus was on gambling, mostly over big prize-winning fights. He managed the books and tracked down payments that needed to be made. And if someone didn't pay, well, we know what happened to them. It was during this time, running with the big boys in California and running back and forth to Chicago, that Charlie allegedly committed 2 murders against individuals who had confronted Barron over fixed boxing matches. Barron did no time for his crimes, and by the 1950s, he really stepped into his own as a member of the Chicago outfit. Around the end of the 1940s, early 1950s, Charlie Barron got sent down to Cuba by, you guessed it, Meyer Lansky, where he was set up to manage one of their casinos. While Roselli was running Sanssouci, Barron got set up in the Havana Riviera. It was the biggest job he'd had so far, so big that Charlie got forced to diversify. He had to diversify his portfolio. He opened up a car dealership in Chicago to make things look clean. This dealership still exists to this day, Charlie Barron Ford. It was a big deal back then, and Charlie used the dealership to his maximum advantage. By 1954, Charlie Barron was dating Joan Crawford. The papers were splashed with details of their time together. Barron was showering Crawford, the papers claimed, in jewels, and he had even given her a brand new station wagon from his own Ford dealership. Barron was more often by Joan's side than not in their 3 years together. He went to movie premieres with her, he took her on lavish holidays, and spoiled her every Christmas. By 1957, however, the relationship had fizzled out, and Charlie Barron was rumored to be with a new fling. This time, it was, and I kid you not, Ginger Rogers. She came down to Cuba to perform at the mafia-owned and operated Havana Riviera and was romantically linked to Charlie Barron via the papers of the time. The papers claimed that the Cuban rebirth was the relaunch of her career, much as Sinatra had been relaunched by Roselli. I think Ginger Rogers and Jane Mansfield, as we'll see in a minute, were like Charlie Barron's Sinatra, essentially. The next time we see Charlie's name in the rumor mill, it's at the Tropicana Hotel in Las Vegas, where Meyer Lansky, once again, who, we also brought him up in the Kardashians Kardashian episodes. Isn't that interesting? He had dispatched Charlie Barron to Vegas to manage Tropicana by 1958. That same year, 1958, the hotel Tropicana launched a scandalous striptease review hosted and starred in by the incomparable Jane Mansfield. Jane's show opened at the Tropicana in February of 1958, and it scandalized the general public. Jane, however, didn't seem to mind because Charlie Barron had already signed to pay her a whopping $2,000 per hour or $25,000 per week for an 8-week extended contract. It was no doubt those figures and Jane's stunning figure that kicked the gossip columns into high gear, alleging that Jane was a romantic partner of Charlie Barron and the two were often seen out on town whining and dining together. But that would be some pretty curious timing because Jane had just gotten married to Mickey Hargitay, right? And Mickey Hargitay also co-starred in this striptease show. So, but who knows? We're talking about organized crime who were running brothels and, trying to assassinate elected officials. So, who knows? Who knows what was going on? Charlie led a raucous good time at the Tropicana Hotel, and he made a lot of celebrity friends by the look of it. If you look him up in the old papers, I've been going back and looking, and they have so many photos of him. And you'll basically just see him he's always at parties. He's always at parties that are packed to the gill with people like Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, Eddie Kovacs, Judy Garland, and 500,000 others, man. There's so many celebrities. Charlie was so close to his celebrity friends that he ended up serving as the man of honor to Philip Crosby, the son of Bing Crosby, when he got married to one of Tropicana's dancing girls in 1958. And fun fact, Bing Crosby's twin sons, they both got married to Tropicana dancing girls. By 1960, however, Charlie Barron was on to bigger and better things, namely the Sands Hotel, where he was installed as manager around that same time. And this, boys and girls, is where it's about to get really, really weird. I saved the weird for last. So Charlie Barron was a big social guy, and he was really, really social in the 50s and 60s when he had all this money and he's running a comfy show from the Sands Hotel, right? Everyone back then who was around Vegas, who was around these Hollywood stars, they knew who Charlie was, like literally everyone. And it wasn't uncommon to find big names in both politics and business gathering at his house on Sundays for his Sunday afternoon barbecues, where he partied with his mafia friends and politicians and business leaders. Isn't that great? Yes, Charlie Barron was a connected man. Dig up old pictures from his time in Vegas, and you're going to not just find him rubbing arms with Frank Sinatra, who was his best buddy. Oh no, look around long enough and you find Charlie Barron rubbing elbows with Bob Mayhew, who was also working with Roselli at local Las Vegas government functions. Does that name sound familiar? Yeah, that's probably because Bob Mayhew is a man who worked for the CIA who recruited Johnny Roselli to help the government assassinate Fidel Castro and probably JFK too. Yeah, it turns out that Charlie Barron was also deeply involved in the CIA's plot and often socialized with Bob Mayhew, the guy helping to coordinate the plots between the CIA and the mafia. But here's where things get really crazy. All right, are you ready? Buckle up. Because in 2019, it was revealed through extensive research and interviews that Charlie Barron was also a close personal friend of Jay Sebring, Frank Sinatra's hairdresser. Does that name sound familiar? It should, because that's one of the 5 victims from the Manson murders on Cielo Drive. Remember those 5 people who were killed inside that house? Murdered in 1969 alongside Sharon Tate, Wojtek Frykowski, Abigail Folger, and Stephen Parent? Yeah, that Jay Sebring. Yeah. It was in Tom O'Neill's 2019 book, Chaos, The Truth Behind the Manson Murders, that he was able to connect the pieces through Jay Sebring's former apprentice, Joe Torrenueva. According to Joe, who spent an inordinate amount of time with Jay Sebring in the months and days before his death, Charlie Barron was a close friend of Jay Sebring, and through him, Jay had become close personal friends with a lot of the other big mafia guys in Vegas that surrounded Barron at the time, like Johnny Roselli. According to Joe, Jay Sebring flew to Las Vegas every week or every other week and partied regularly with this whole crew of mafia people that were all around Charlie Barron. In the book, Torrenueva gives a particularly harrowing story of how the morning after the Cielo Drive murders, the morning after Sharon Tate and Wojtek and all of them were killed, he gets a phone call from Charlie Barron. He's just found out that his boss is dead in a house with a bunch of other people, and Charlie Barron calls him. And Charlie Barron tells him he doesn't have anything to worry about. which really freaks Joe Tornueva out. You haven't done anything wrong, Barron assured him before hanging up. It creates some interesting questions. Had Jay Sebring gotten in over his head, like on some bad business? Like, what does that mean? They call the apprentice to say, well, you haven't done anything wrong. It's kind of insinuating that Jay Sebring had, right? So like, had he done some bad business deals or something? That's what Tornueva thought. The former apprentice thought that it was possible that he had gotten on the bad side of a business deal. He said that Jay had been involved in a lot of bad business deal in like the months before his death, that he was just really bad at business. So like, is that what happened? Was he involved in some kind of mafia drug smuggling? We know that he was huge into drugs and everyone in that house just had these huge drug parties and stuff. So did he get himself in with some crime syndicate that was dealing drugs and then he crossed the line? Like, what do we think happened? I won't go into all the ins and outs here. If you want those, go and listen to the bonus episode I did on Sharon Tate and the Manson murders, or you can go and get that book Chaos by Tom O'Neill. It's over on Patreon. Like, you can get way more. There's way more to it, but that's essentially a very interesting connection. Like, you can't help but to admit it's very odd that a man who is socializing with a bunch of mafia guys who also happen to be working with CIA guys ends up dead in a house filled with other people who have drug and intelligence ties who also end up dead. It really makes you start to question narratives, I guess. I think that's probably like the way I should put that. But anyway, this will be the last big Hollywood association with Charlie Barron, the Manson murders, and his ties to one of the most chaotic, violent, and shadow-filled times in American history. Did Charlie Barron have something to do with the murders themselves? Did he have something against Jay and Sharon and the rest of the people just got in the way? Like, we don't know yet. We don't know. Tom O'Neill is currently, he just sat through a whole round of Senate hearings where they were grilling him about all this new evidence that he had discovered that could link, Charlie Barron to the JFK plot. But we know for a fact that the CIA through Bob Mayhew was working with all these mafia guys like Roselli and Meyer Lansky, and Charlie Barron was one of the ones they contacted. He's been photographed with Mayhew. So it's just really interesting. It's really interesting. It makes you wonder if we're going to find out more about Charlie Barron over the years. So, maybe time will tell and maybe it won't. These are hardly the first or only mafia relations in the deep history of Hollywood, but they are some of the most prominent and most important. Through these connections, specifically to Roselli and Barron, one starts to see a pattern emerging, if one cares to look close enough. A pattern of corruption, surely, but it's more than that. The story of Hollywood and the mafia, the Hollywood and the CIA, is a story of a hostile takeover. The artists came to Hollywood first. They tried to create something beautiful and they succeeded. They were rewarded for their vision. The people of the public paid tribute, happy to see fantasy and imagination brought to life in such visceral form. But as with all new and beautiful things that are created in this world, it was soon consolidated, repackaged, and branded, though the branding was not at first what it appeared to be. The mafia saw the success of Hollywood as something to be beaten into submission and bent beneath their will for their benefit only. And when they succeeded in that, the government came along to follow suit. When you pay attention to how characters like Roselli and Barron moved, when you follow their careers with the CIA, you can see shades of history repeating itself. The mafia came to Hollywood and said, let us fix your labor issues, let us handle it, and all the problems will go away. Before the studio executives knew it, the wolves were at the door and they were the sheep being corralled into the pen. The same thing happened in the 40s and again in the 60s when the government decided this is ours now. They said, we're going to clean up Hollywood. Then they installed their own corrupt ministers. Nothing changed, nothing got better, but the money moved up to the U.S. Treasury instead of down to the people who were actually making the movies. The next strong arm came in the 1960s when, once again at war, the government through the CIA said, come on, we'll make you legitimate. We'll take you under our wing, and all you have to do is play God with us and help us assassinate a few global leaders and set the world into chaos for gain. What's to lose? Before they knew it, characters like Roselli were no longer heads of casinos. They were floating in barrels in Miami Harbor. It makes you think that Al Capone had a point when he allegedly said, and I don't know if this is true, but if it is true, it's an epic quote. He allegedly said, capitalists believe that they can take everything at the table as belonging to them. Capitalism is the legitimate racket of the ruling class. But even if he didn't say that, why? Doesn't that just kind of fit into this whole thing? What does that quote look like when we look at the Hollywood of today? The Hollywood that is still running pimps, whores, and drugs, even while the biggest studios pump out wholesome, Americanized Marvel film pro-war propaganda. Did the capitalists and the government behind them decide that it was their turn to benefit off the cesspool that is Hollywood? I suppose that's an answer that we'll all have to decide for ourselves. And that's it. That is it for today's episode. Oh my gosh. I didn't know if I was going to get through that. I wanted to give you guys some unexpected names, some unexpected stories that really tied into things that matter, real deal, to show you how this Hollywood machine is tied to like the government. It's an arm of propaganda. It's an arm of corruption. It's an arm for crime, right? So hopefully you see that, did you learn something? Did any of this blow your mind? Researching this, I was blown away by a lot of it because it's a really wild world. And like, I didn't even get to talk about it. We've talked about 3 people, all of that, all this time, over an hour. 3 people. That's all we could cover. And I had to yada so many of the details, especially with the mafia, because there's so many extra people and moving pieces and suicides and like all kinds of stuff. But you just can't put down every single one. But I tried to do as many as possible. So I think you see the pattern. I think you see how things were shaped by the mafia and just how deeply entrenched they were. It's wild. It's wild. And it was also wild to see so many like big names tied to these figures, especially I didn't expect Ginger Rogers. Harlow, we know about. I talked about Jean Harlow's mafia ties in the Jean Harlow episode. Go back and listen to that. She had a boyfriend who funded a lot of the studios. But Ginger Rogers, I just did not expect. They've done so well painting her as like America's sweetheart. But I should have known after seeing the little kind of act that she had in the Gold Diggers of 1933. I probably should have been a little bit more suspicious. But anyway, it's wild. And it's now set the stage for you and I to take a look at some deeper things, because I've been toying with the CIA and Hollywood stuff for a while. But I realized when I was getting ready to do that series for you that really you need to understand how deeply entrenched the mafia was so that you could then understand how the CIA came in, took over them, used them during World War II, and then went after again in the 60s and Castro and JFK. It's crazy. It's crazy. And that's the pattern. So we've got the base now. You've got the base. You've got a general idea of how the Hollywood machine works, how it's pretty much worked solidly since the 1920s. And you won't be surprised when we start to cover like the really crazy stuff, right? If you want some references for today's episode, check out the book Chaos by Tom O'Neill. Also check out Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. I cannot explain to you how important it is that you read The Devil's Chessboard by David Talbot. You can also check out that article that I mentioned from Donis Casey that's available free to read on crimereads.com. And I also recommend checking out, there's this really interesting website on the Lincoln Tavern, and it was fascinating. I spent so much time on it, just scrolling through it, especially if you like jazz and Chicago history. It's this blog called Along the Gradient. So Gradyent, like a person named Grady. It's got some really great deep dives into Chicago roadhouses during the Prohibition. I'm thinking about doing an episode because some of these roadhouses in Chicago got into like a bombing war with each other, and people's houses were getting fireballed, like all kinds of stuff. Just really crazy turf wars, really fascinating stuff. So if you want to learn more about that, go to Gradient, gradyent.blogspot.com. I'll link it in the description of this episode, but it's really, really fascinating. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. And I obviously used it for this episode. So yeah, I think you see it all now. And if not, hopefully you're starting to. The vicious patterns between Hollywood and the mafia. And yeah, that's it. That's going to be it for me today, folks. I've done my duty. I gotta go tuck it in for the day. I hope you loved this episode. I hope you found it fascinating. If you want to keep the deep dives going, head over to patreon.com/scandalqueens. That's the home of everything Scandal Queens. And I'm posting a lot of great deep dives into Hollywood, the mafia, the CIA, and I've even gotten into the Manson murders on some subscriber only bonus episodes. So head over to patreon.com/scandalqueens if you want early episodes, bonus episodes, weekly deep dives, and even more juicy details on all this corruption around Hollywood and the mafia, et cetera, et cetera. If you're more into the psychology side of things, head over to therealebjohnson.substack.com, where I have more than 2,000 guides and resources that look at relationships, personality, mental health, family, narcissism, and so much more. There's a lot of you I know who used to follow me when I was, I still technically am an NLPMP. I just don't practice anymore. I don't coach. I don't do any of that stuff. It was just too hard on me. But if you still want to learn, I am still writing and adding guides. So go to Substack if you want that kind of stuff. For everyone else, follow me on social media at therealebjohnson.com. That's it. I'm not like the Real EB Johnson 1. I'm not the Real EB Johnson fave. Nothing like that. It's at the Real EB Johnson. And I am on Instagram. I'm on TikTok, and I am on YouTube. And that's pretty much it. So follow me there for short videos and updates. And last but not least, if you loved this episode, please consider leaving a quick 5-star review on Apple or Spotify. I do everything on this podcast myself: research, production, editing, and And like I mentioned, the Swifties tried to tank me with a ton of bad reviews earlier this year, end of last year. So it means so much if you could just leave a 5-star review and help me get this podcast in front of more listeners like you who want to deconstruct the narcissistic cult of Hollywood and see how the mafia and the CIA use it for propaganda and crime. So for everyone else, thank you for listening. There are thousands of you listening every week. It's crazy. I cannot believe there's thousands of people listening to this every week. So thank you. I'm going to keep going, keep bringing you new episodes every week, and we'll see where this goes. Truly stoked that you guys like to listen to me ramble. So thank you. I can't even tell you how much it means. It's you guys have just really helped keep me on my feet. So thank you. I love you. And I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, keep your secrets close and your receipts closer. Stay scandalous, queens. Bye-bye.